Our presentation tonight is from one of our newest members of the Society, Pascal LEBLOND, who will speak on Yves BARIL, Master Engraver. Charles, do you have Pascal's story?
Pascal LEBLOND. Pascal has been involved in philately for almost 50 years. What started as a hobby, collecting first-day covers, became a full-time job at Library and Archives Canada 24 years ago. His first assignment at LAC was to verify and validate the information related to each Canadian stamp issued since 1851 for the new Canadian Postal Archives website. Since 2014, he manages the visual and sound archives at LAC. His responsibilities include archival fonds and collections from private sources related to philately, including the Yves BARIL fonds. Pascal is a member of BNAP since 2007 and of the Académie Québécoise de Philately since 2021. The items in this presentation are mostly from the Yves BARIL fonds and the Post Office Department fonds at Library and Archives Canada.
Presenting Yves BARIL, Master Engraver, is Pascal LEBLOND. Pascal?
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Right. So, the work of stamp engravers in Canada was largely unknown and uncredited until the 1970s. The most prolific of them is Yves BARIL, who worked for 43 years at the Canadian Banknote Company in Ottawa, engraving not only stamps, but also banknotes, shares, and bond certificates, labels, and coupons. Much of what we know about the stamp engravers working at the Canadian Banknote from the 40s to the 70s, we owe to Yves BARIL through his notebooks and his personal and unique collection of first-day covers, which he donated to Library and Archives Canada between 2009 and 2015. This presentation will demonstrate how his own records enhance our understanding of the creation of Canadian stamps and complement Canada Post official records. Some of his tools are represented here in a photo taken during his visit to Library and Archives Canada in December 2016, when he was visiting us for an oral history interview. You can see some of his tools like etching point or needle, and some of his burin, also known as gravers. When I was hired in 2000 by the National Archives to work on the Canadian Postal Archives website, I realized quickly that there was limited information on stamp engravers prior to the 1970s. Contrary to other countries like France or Sweden, their names don't appear on the stamp themselves. Their initials are not even on the die proofs used by Canada Post in Ottawa to approve their engraving. This photo, taken by the National Film Board in 1957, exemplified the situation. The man is not identified. We see that he's engraving the 15-cent UPU stamp, and thanks to his notebooks, we know that Yves BARIL was the engraver of this stamp. Therefore, he's probably the man depicted in the photo. And just to be sure, he kindly confirmed it by phone to me last week. The quote from the British engraver Joseph Keane seems appropriate in that context because it corroborates the secrecy surrounding British, Canadian, and American stamp engravers for a long time. So the first engraver recognized by Canada Post was Arthur Gunderson in 1971 for the Pierre Laporte stamp. However, the marginal imprint only mentioned his contribution as the designer, as you can see here. We must wait until the Church Leaders issue in 1975 to see an engraver's name printed in the margin, as you can see here. And sadly, this was the last stamp issue engraved by George Gunderson before he retired in 1975. That was fine for the British American banknote, but what about the Canadian banknote? In 1978, the Prairie Street Scene stamp was issued, printed by British American banknote. The margin shows the name of the engraver, Arthur Ponting. When the same stamp was re-engraved and printed by the Canadian banknote in December of the same year, the name of the engraver, Yves Baril, doesn't appear in the margin. He had to wait until the Diefenbaker stamp in 1980 for that recognition, and this was his 120th Canadian stamp. Here's another anonymous photo of Yves Baril, this time taken on January 7, 1966. According to his notebooks, on that day, he was engraving the master die of the 1966 Christmas stamp. If you remember, these are the two hands by Albrecht Dürer, the famous German engraver of the Middle Age. Yves Baril was born in Verdun in 1932, on the south shore of Montreal. He graduated from the School of Graphic Arts in Montreal in 1951 with a diploma in typography. Two of his professors had an impact on his career. First, Albert Dumouchel, who is considered a father of engraving in Quebec, and is an artist in his own right. Interestingly enough, in January 1960, the Postmaster General announced to reporters that Albert Dumouchel would be the designer of the Dollars des Ormeaux stamp to be issued later that year. But we all know now that it was not the case, and the stamp was designed by Philippe Weiss instead. His other professor was Arthur Gladu, and Arthur Gladu was also a member of the Stamp Advisory Committee. So this is how he learned that the Canadian banknote was looking for an engraver and provide the information to Yves Baril. Yves Baril started his apprenticeship at the Canadian banknote on January 3rd, 1953 with Silas Robert Allen. At the time, it usually took 10 years of training before an engraver can submit the first die for approval. Baril learned quickly. His first stamp engraving was approved by Canada Post in 1955. With the retirement of Allen in 1957, Yves Baril continued his training with visits to the American banknote in New York. During his career at the Canadian banknote from 53 to 96, Yves Baril engraved more than 146 Canadian postage stamps, more than any other engraver. The first major article devoted to Yves Baril was written by Jacques Nollet in 1987 in Les Cahiers de l'Académie. Based on discussion with the engraver, the information provided in the article is supported by the detailed notebooks kept by Baril during his career. So the Yves Baril font. One of the main features in the Yves Baril font is his notebooks that present a vivid first-hand account of his work at the Canadian banknote, predominantly in the 50s and the 60s. They provide key information missing from official records of the era, such as the name of the engravers who work on a specific stamp, be it the portrait engraver or the letter engraver, the time spent by Yves Baril on each die, and the period he devoted to it. The other notebooks provide a more in-depth look at how each stamp was engraved, as well as his personal opinion on each project. I'm not aware of any other engraver or designer in Canada or elsewhere who documented their creation with that level of details. For example, if you look on the photo on the left side of the screen, this is his notebook when each day he noted each engraving that he was working on, each die. So you have the official number of the Canadian banknote, XG, for example, for a postage stamp. But they all there, and he indicate the number of hours that he devoted to each task. And sometimes you see days when he was engraving for 11 hours. 11 hours, it's a lot of time during a day to work on a tiny piece of steel. The other part of his phone that I found fascinating is the first day cover collection. This is a quite unique first day cover collection because it documents the Canadian banknote employees who participated in the engraving of specific stamp while Yves Baril was an employee of the Canadian banknote. For example, the first day cover on the left of the screen for the Alberta and Saskatchewan stamp of 1955 is signed by Yves Baril as the engraver. And there are also initials in the lower left corner, JM for John Mash, one of the letter engravers. These first day covers also document stamp engraved by other engravers working at the Canadian banknote. So on the left, on the right side, you have the first day cover for the Coats of Arms issue of 1966, which was engraved by Alan Carswell, who was the engraver. And under the cancellation, you see the name of Harvey Prosser, who was the designer of the stamp. And in the lower left corner, you see GM for Gordon Mash, who was the letter engraver and the son of John Mash. So his mentor at Canadian Banknote was Silas Robert Allen. And on his first day at the Canadian Banknote, he was assigned to Allen, who is considered the founder of the Canadian School of Engraving. He was at the Canadian Banknote since 1922. And before him, most of the Canadian stamps were engraved in New York. He engraved more than 60 Canadian stamps. And we know a lot about Allen thanks to Yves Baril, because in his notebooks, he took the time to talk about Allen and to note all the stamp that Allen engraved for Canada. And to exemplify his style of engraving, I'm going to give you a quote from the notebook from Yves Baril, and the translation is mine, but here it is. This stamp clearly demonstrates the engraving style of Silas Allen. The engraving, instead of being rigid, cold, absolutely correct, is fuzzy, warm, hesitant. The lines are not clear. As a result, Silas' engravings are more human than perfect, which makes counterfeiting practically impossible. His peer at the British American Banknote was George Arthur Gunderson. You have to remember that from 1935 to 68, the only security printer who had a contract for Canadian postage stamp was the Canadian Banknote. And George Gunderson was desperately trying to get a contract, and he succeeded to have a contract in 68. And from starting in 68, there was a friendly competition between the two security printers. What is unique about George Gunderson is that from 47 to 1950, he worked at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington, D.C., and he engraved a number of American stamps. Upon his return in 1953, he became the art director of the British American Banknote. And contrary to Yves Baril, George Gunderson is also considered a stamp designer. And during the career of both engravers, they interact or compete directly or indirectly on 3 postage stamp projects over the years. First in 1957 for the David Thompson stamp, then in 1959 for the Royal Visit stamp, and finally in 1971 for the Pierre Laporte stamp. Sadly, Gunderson passed away less than 1 month after retiring in 1975. As I mentioned, the notebooks of Yves Baril are quite unique, and they allow us to do all sorts of analysis. For example, I took the year 1959, and I look at everything he did as an engraver at the Canadian banknote during that time. And 50% of his engraving time was spent doing work for other projects than postage stamps. For example, shares and bond certificates, label, coupon. In 59, for example, he did work for the Nova Scotia Light and Power Company in Nova Scotia, or the Ontario Hydro, or he did also traveler's checks and things like that. 30% of his time was devoted, or 400 hours was devoted to Canada Post Department for 3 stamp dies: the NATO stamp, the Seaway stamp, and the Plains of Abraham. And surprisingly, 20% was devoted to do postage stamp for the United Nations Postal Administration. And he did 4 stamp dies for this postal administration. And in 1959, surprisingly or not, Canadian banknote had the contract to print the UN stamps. In 1955, we have the Alberta and Saskatchewan stamp. And you're going to see on the rest of the slides that I'm selecting a number of stamps to show his work and how his notebooks allow us to have a better understanding of the records from Canada Post. And so you see that here, based on his notebooks, he's devoted 19 hours to that stamp, but it's probably more than that, because this is his first official stamp. And the story beyond that for that stamp is quite interesting, is because the stamp was assigned to Alan, who was the senior engraver at the Canadian banknote. But as is usual for apprentice, BARIL was practicing using the same model or practicing with other stamps. And the die made by Alan, unfortunately, was rejected after review by the designer, who was Lawrence Hyde. Fortunately, there was no time to ask the American banknote in New York to engrave a new one. But the Canadian banknote realized that Yves BARIL had done the same design as a practice die, and they found that it was pretty good. And so they submitted it to the post office, and to the delight of Yves BARIL, and it was accepted. So here you have 2 die proofs from the Canada Post Fund at Library and Archives Canada. The one on the left is dated January 19, 1955. And thanks to the notebook from Yves BARIL, we know that this is the one that was engraved by Silas Allen. The one on the right of the screen, the approved one, was therefore the one engraved by Yves BARIL. But we know from his notebooks that Allen helped him to finish it because he was still learning how to engrave stamp with all the final details. But ultimately, Yves BARIL was very satisfied that he was able to have his first stamp approved while he was still in his second year as an apprentice, because remember, it was taking at the time 8 to 10 years to be able to engrave your first stamp, and he did it in only 2.5 years. You can compare the work of the 2 engravers with the original artwork by Lawrence Hyde, which is in the middle. And you see that the one on the left is the die by Allen. And you see that you understand a bit more the complaint from the stamp designer, because you see that the faces of the the figures are a bit coarser than the original artwork, while the stamp design engraved by Yves Baril on the other side, it is much closer to the actual design by Lawrence Hyde. And this is a great example of how the notebook provides additional information not found in the official records. So around the same time, Baril, who was still during his apprenticeship, helped out with the International Civil Aviation Organization stamp, which was almost entirely engraved by John Mash, which was a letter engraver. So Baril helped with the gradient in the background, and you see in the middle there's the stamp without the background, and on the right side, the next phase where the background has been the gradient has been completed. Next one, please. So the next project that was assigned to Yves Baril was the part of the Canada's All Playground issue, which was the first centenary issue released by Canada Post. And it's a good opportunity to compare the style of Silas Allen and Yves Baril, because Allen engraved the fishing and skiing stamp while Baril was doing the swimming and hunting ones. The history of the swimming stamp is a bit complicated, because Yves Baril had to redo the die of the swimming stamp because the tip of his burin or graver broke. And out of frustration, he threw the tool across the workshop. And unfortunately, the tool bounced back on the wall and hit the cheek of the swimmer on the die. And unfortunately, it was impossible to repair. And so amazingly, you can find the die proof in the Canada Post font that says literally second engraving of face, which confirm his notebooks. And sadly, the skiing stamp was the last one done by Silas Allen before his semi-retirement. And so basically, Yves Baril lost a mentor, and he was able to continue his training by frequent trips to New York with the American banknote. And here you have two additional die proofs from the swimming stamp. And interestingly, Yves Baril doesn't mention this third engraving of the face, which is the die proof on the left side of the screen. And the final approved die is on the right side. So in 1957, we have the David Thompson stamp. The stamp, as I mentioned before, was designed by George Gunderson of the British American banknote. But since the contract was with the Canadian banknote, it's Yves Baril who engraved the stamp. And interestingly, in his notebook, he mentioned that shortly after, I'm assuming, the release of the stamp, he met George Gunderson. And interestingly, George Gunderson thought that the engraving of the stamp was, as he mentioned in his notebook, correct, which probably is a compliment coming from Gunderson. However, Gunderson was really not happy that his design was modified without being consulted, because you can see on the right side, this is the actual model for the stamp, and you see that the modern frontiers between the provinces were omitted on the final stamp, as well as the inscription Pacific Ocean. The removal of the inscription Pacific Ocean is quite understandably because it would have need to be bilingual, and there was no place on the design to add the French title. Also in 57, the UPU Congress stamp is a key milestone in his career. And you see here, it's the same photo that we showed earlier. Initially, the die for the stamp was assigned to John Mash, a letter engraver. But since the result was not satisfactory, Canadian Banknote wanted to ask the American Banknote to redo the die. And he very convinced successfully his management to let him try to do it. And essentially, he was very proud of this one because it's a key point in his career, as I mentioned, because it proved to Canadian Banknote that it could do the job. They can rely on him. And you can see that it took him 66.5 hours to do that work. So in 1958, he engraved the stamp known as the First Elected Assembly of Nova Scotia. What's interesting with this stamp is that it's entirely made by etching with acid. So with a good magnifying glass, you can admire the details on the mace and on the chair, and notably the coat of arms at the top of the chair. There is a slightly darker line on the right side of the stamp. So if you go from the top right corner and you count 19 lines, you will see a line that is slightly darker. This was an unfortunate incident because it was a correction made by the head of the engraving department because he thought that the line was weak. And he very mentioned in his notebooks that this should have never been done. And it was too late to correct it when he realized that what happened. So in 59, obviously there was the Seaway stamp, but interestingly, also was the golden anniversary of flight. And although the stamp design was evidently based on the Avro arrow, Yves Baril was asked to deviate slightly from the design. So it should be the same plane, but not the same plane, So, and he listed the modification in his notebook. So they include, for example, the front of the cockpit is rounded instead of pointed like on the model. The cockpit has been lengthened and changed in appearance from 4 to 6 windows. The shape of the air inlets have been changed. The wing attack line was placed on the same plane instead of 2 planes. The shape of the air outlet has been changed. The middle protrusion has been removed. And the rear shape of the wings was changed to a more obtuse angle. This stamp, the Royal Visit of 1959, is considered by Yves Baril to be his best work, and it was based on the famous Antigone portrait of the Queen. Since this portrait was reproduced multiple times throughout the Commonwealth, it was an excellent opportunity for Yves Baril to compare his work with those of other engravers. It's amazing that he devoted more than 400 hours to create that masterpiece. First at the American Banknote in New York, where he spent several weeks. And since Baril didn't have enough experience, American Banknote assigned this important work to the engraver Joseph Poveromo. And unbeknownst to him, it seems that George Gunderson was at the British American Banknote, was also working on his own version. And upon his return to Ottawa, Yves Baril convinced Canadian Banknote to let him start from scratch, since he was not satisfied with his first die engraved in the American Banknote style. So that's why on the slide you see die 1 from February 57 to April 57, and then die 2 from April to July. So it looks like, at the very least, 3 dies were submitted to Canada Post. One by Yves Baril from Canadian Banknote, one by Joseph Poveromo from the American Banknote, and potentially one also by George Gunderson from the British American Banknote. You can compare here the difference between Baril on the issue stamp and the engraving by George Gunderson, which is from his own fund at Library and Archives Canada. You can clearly see that the treatment of the face is different, and as well as the hair of the of Queen Elizabeth. So far, I have not been able to identify the Poveromo die yet at Library and Archives Canada, because you have to realize that it probably came through Canadian Banknote, and since there's no name attached to the die proofs, you would have to compare each die proof to figure out which one is probably is. And one other puzzling thing is that I don't know why this die by Yves Baril doesn't have an official Canadian banknote number, which start with an X and a G. And in his notebook, Yves Baril also confessed that he made a mistake on the crown next to the head of the Queen, because one pearl is missing on one side of the crown. So on one side you have 10 pearls, and on the other side you have 11. So we jump to 1963 for the Casimir Gzowski stamp. This was a beautiful design by Philip Weiss. But you can ask yourself, why was it issued in pink? Because Casimir Gzowski was an engineer, and but according to Yves Baril, the Postmaster General at the time, Helen Fairclough, requested the stamp to be printed in pink instead of gray. It's obviously unfortunate because the details are much more difficult to distinguish. I think you can see clearly that on the gray or black stamp die proof, you can see much better the details of the locomotive, the bridge, and the ship in the background. And here you have the, in the Canada Post phone, you have 2 dies that confirm the change of color, because on one side you have the die proof approved for engraving only, and there's a note saying not for color, and it's dated January 17. And on the other side, you have the pink or purple die proof, which says it's approved for printing by the Postmaster General. And the decision apparently was made within a week. Also in 1963, we have the interesting stamp for the export trade, the $1 stamp. The first die was the one on the right, which was never issued, but was still engraved. So it's in his notebook, he doesn't know why the first model was rejected. But he mentioned that Don Mitchell, another of the letter engravers, did the lettering on both dies. Both dies were entirely made with a needle or a point, and reworked with a burin, especially for the crane. Also in 1963, we have another color imbroglio, if I may say so. The stamp was made with 2 dies because there's 2 colors. Alan Carswell engraved the lettering on die 1, and the background was done with the lining machine. The horse on the other side was engrave on die 2. The design required a green horse. According to BARIL, the Postmaster General, at the time it was Azilus Denis, asked for the color to be reversed because he apparently never saw a green horse in his life. So, and you can compare that in brown, the horse seems to lose a lot of his beauty and becoming a bit dull. Here you have also in 1963, one Canadian stamp that I think is probably one of the most beautifully engraved stamp in Canada. It's based on a very beautiful drawing by Angus Short, who was an artist working for Darks Unlimited for over 30 years. It's well drawn, clear, precise, and in order to practice to be able to do justice to that drawing, Yves Barry practiced by making exact copy of the Norwegian stamp of 1956 showing the 5 flying swans, each representing the Nordic countries, and engraved by the Swedish chief engraver Sven Evert. He was able to properly capture the texture of the geese feathers. And I think it's a great result. And Yves Barry was very proud of it. And he always considered it to be one of his best stamps. So in 65, we have the Churchill stamp. And according to Yves Barry, the engraving version that you see next to the issued stamp was not a success because of the small stamp size. In the end, the lithographic version was used, which was a first for a Canadian stamp. And Yves Barry thought that just the face of Churchill should have been used like in other countries, because if you remember in 65, there was a number of postal administration issue stamp in honor of Churchill, the UK and the US. But it seems that Canada Post wanted to use the full Karsh photo instead. And interestingly enough, this stamp marks the beginning of the transition of printing processes in Canada, because within 10 years, the majority of Canadian stamps will be printed by lithography. And finally, the last stamp I want to show you is the Pierre Laporte stamp of 1971. This was supposed to be a small stamp, like a definitive stamp of the time. And the stamp was not supposed to be from a known photo, but from a mix of several photos to avoid figuring out the provenance. And apparently, they were trying to avoid using a Karsh photo. Yves Barry did several essays of small dimension, and they were sent to Canada Post, where I found them in the Canada Post phone. So you have it here. It's a bit odd that the die proof showed that the date 1971, since Pierre Laporte was murdered in 1970. But then Yves Barry realized the British American banknote was working on a similar project, but on a double-sized stamp using a photo taken by Michel Giroux, who was a known photojournalist at the time, which seems to have been contrary to the specification that Canadian banknote received. And then Yves Barry did also a double-sized stamp using the same photo. But so far, I've not been able to locate that second die proof of Yves Barry. Here you have some resources in relation to Yves Barry. You have the link to his phone on our website. You have the link to the key article by Jacques Nollet, Yves Barry, the last of our engravers. And you have also the article by Yves Barry himself, which was also published by the Académie Québécoise de Philatélie. And I hope that this presentation will interest you to visit us online or in person to consult the Yves Baril Fond and other archival records preserved at Library and Archives Canada. I also invite you to take a closer look at these and other engraved stamps with your favorite magnifying glass or microscope to appreciate all their tiny details. This is a great way to appreciate the work of engravers like Yves Baril. Thank you.
Why were, you mentioned right at the beginning that many countries put the name of the engraver on the stamps. The French stamps do, I believe. What was the hesitation in Canada of doing that?
That's a very good question, and I have no answer to that. I know that in the 50s, they start hiring stamp designers outside of security printers, because before that, the design was made by security printers in Canada. And we see, for example, in 53 for the wildlife series that Emmanuel Hahn, who was the designer, he was able to put his monogram on the design, and that was okay. But for stamp engravers, it's always been, I think it's part of a British or American tradition, because it took a very long time for them to be recognized. And we only see them appearing in the 70s. And I'm not sure, there's probably a file somewhere that explains why they decided at one point in time, oh, we need to put them there. Because I think historically, because in the 50s, Canada Post started to hire the designers, they had a direct relation with the designers. So it was much easier for them to say, okay, you're the designer, we're paying you to design a stamp. So eventually we'll put your name in the margin or something like that. But the relationship between Canada Post and the engravers was not a direct link, because they were employees of the security printer. And so when you read correspondence between Canadian Banknote and the Post Office Department, they never mention the name of the engraver. They say, here's the die proof, and either Canada Post will approve them, or they would say, oh, well, the designer said that, no, that's not acceptable. Can you redo it? But there was never any relation or discussion directly, apparently, between the two. And so the engraving was the product of the company and not the product of the engraver. And probably that's why they were not recognized.
I have a question which is sort of related to Michelle's in terms of engravers not getting credit for their work. I was struck by, you mentioned there's a 10-year apprenticeship. There's incredible skill level. Do you have any idea what sort of salary these engravers received? Was it, it should be high, high salary for their skill level, but maybe if they weren't allowed to put their names on the stamps, they were considered a sort of low-paid tradesman.
I don't know. I have no idea what the salary was, but what I understand is that, how should I put it? There was definitely a hierarchy of engravers in a security printers like in banknote, because letter engravers were considered lower than picture engraver or portrait engravers like Yves Baril, because the technicality and the skills required were much higher. And I'm assuming that they were probably well paid, because you have to remember that Silas Allen was basically alone for a long time. He had some apprentice from time to time, but when Yves Baril arrived, there was only the two of them. I mean, your business is based on two guys essentially when you do security products, and so I'm hoping they were well paid.
Deserve it.
Wow.
I really appreciate you sort of reintroducing me to stamps of my youth in the 50s and early 60s. Uh, I do a thing where I put stamps on Instagram just for the beauty of the stamp. And because I realized once I started scanning stamps, when they're blown up on your computer screen, you realize the amount of design work and artwork and all that stuff that goes into it and how beautiful they really are. And I love those stamps from the 50s, but when you see them like that, it just deepens your appreciation of how much work goes into it. On a personal note, I thought that Churchill one was the beginning of the end of beautiful 50s style stamps. And I sort of turned off to Canadian stamps after that. But I mean that export one, the $1 export and the 15-cent geese, absolute masterpieces of graphic design and really of art. So thank you for giving me some good memories of what I picked up at the post office in my early days.
Pleasure.
I have a question about a particular stamp. I collect the 1955 kayak Eskimo hunter, Innu hunter. And I think that most things recognize Alan as being the engraver for that. But when you go to Yves Baril's notebooks, there are entries for his work on that stamp. So how much work did somebody have to do for that to be considered their stamp? Or were there ever situations where it was they were considered co-engravers of the stamp, or was he just so the young guy at the time and most everything was attributed to Alan?
Well, I would need to go back to his notebooks for that specific stamp, but in his notebook, it's often clear that who's the main engraver, because he would say, for example, for the ICAO stamp of 55, oh, I help with the gradient in the background. And he clearly states in his notebook, well, most of the stamp was done by John Mash. And so I think most of the time is very clear about that. I don't remember exactly about the Inuit hunter stamp, but when I revised the information for the Canadian Postal Archives website, I was using resource like the article from Jacques Nollet, because at the time we didn't have the notebooks of Yves Baril on hand. And so that was one way of knowing, oh, okay, that's that, and he must be the main engraver. But there could be a number of hands on a die, and it's not always easy, because if you add the letter engraver, and sometimes Yves Baril was mad because they were starting the die with the lettering, and he would really prefer to do his part first, because then he doesn't have to to deal with the lettering that would be in the way and things like that. So, but yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, but thankfully we have notebooks like that say, oh, okay, so you work on this and he work on that, and because otherwise we would not know, because the official records don't have no recollection of that.
Thank you. I actually only have photographs of the pages. A friend was able to give them to me, so I'll have to go visit them myself.
Pascal, in the slide where you showed like the number of hours that he worked, I think it was in 1959, and 50% of the time was on stamps. And so of the time he spent on stamps, it seemed that it was 300 something hours to produce 3 Canadian dies, and then it was about 200 hours to produce 4 dies for the United Nations. So were the stamps that he made for the United Nations like much simpler? Like, why did he spend that much more time on the Canadian stamps?
It's a good question. I think, if I recall, the UN stamp were a bit more stylized, or maybe there was a larger part that could be assigned to a letter engravers. So it really depends on if the design is much simpler, or it's a bunch of straight lines more than the nuance and the texture of a portrait or things like that. Uh, it can affect the number of hours that you will spend on the die engraving it.
Did he ever mention in his notebooks what he found the most difficult things to engrave? Like, was it portraits?
I think definitely portraits are the most difficult, but he mentioned, especially in his last article, he mentioned that it's it was important for him to be compared to other engravers, in a sense. When he was engraving the portrait of the Queen on any stamp with the Queen, he knew that his likeliness would be compared to others around the Commonwealth, and it was, I think, very motivating for him, because, and he mentioned in some point in his notebooks that was proud that the president of the Canadian Banknote said that this was the best likeness of the Queen that he had ever seen. So it's very gratifying when you say your boss is saying, "Wow, you did an amazing job."
Yeah, yeah. No, that's so cool. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's very, very interesting to get this sort of behind the scenes insights.
Thank you.
Pascal, you mentioned the letter engravers, and would we take that basically all of the stamps would have the letters done by a letter engraver, or do you think that Yves would have done some of that himself? And the second question that I had would deal with the background of the image. I say you had an image and you've got a background that's just basically, cross-hatched or something of that nature. Is there any evidence that someone there would have been a more junior engraver that did those backgrounds as well as the lettering?
Well, to answer your first question, I think it depends on the design, because it's clear in his notebooks that some stamp he did the engraving entirely, including the lettering. It's also, I think, a question of availability, because basically I think they had 2 or 3 letter engravers for all the work that they were doing at the Canadian Banknote. But I think for the when it was required to separate the work, that obviously one part of the die was done by the lettering engravers, and the rest was done by the more experienced or more skilled picture engraver or portrait engraver.
Yeah.
And your second question was about the background.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also something that require a lot of skills, because, as I was mentioning, showing, for example, the 1958 stamp for the first assembly of Nova Scotia, which was entirely done by etching in acid. You have to have the skill of someone like Yves Baril to put all the minute details of the mace and the chair and the coat of arms on such a small stamp. And I think it's not so much, a letter engraver would not be able, I think, to achieve that level of details necessarily.
On one of the stamps that I collect, which is basically back from 1898, a lot of the dies, early dies, have a lot of etch marks in the margins, etc. And I have a theory that what they did with the background, or the spandrel lines, we call them on that, is that they etched that first, right? So they would put a wax or something on top, but then they would mark it with an X-Acto knife or something, and then they would etch that, and then once it was etched, then they had a path to follow for the engraver to use a burn to make a straight line, right? And I just wondered if you saw any kind of evidence of that type of work being done on later stamps as well, right?
I mean, it's a technical question, and I think someone like you, Barry, would be better placed to answer than me. But I'm always amazed when he mentioned playing with acid in his notebooks, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I hope you're doing it safely, because in the 50s, I mean, there was less prevention than today. So but he seems to be fine. I talked to him last week, and he's doing well.
Okay.
But I mean, I don't know the details on how the technicality of the engraving.
But there was mention of acid in his notebook then. Is that what you're saying?
Oh yes, it was one of the way of doing a stamps, because you etch with acid, and then it was one way of doing it.
Yeah. Thank you. Great presentation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Are stamps today still being engraved, or has it been taken over by computers doing the work?
Well, my understanding, for example, in France, they're using computer, but they're still using engravers to, I think, do the engraving with the software. I'm not sure, but I think it's there's the element of computer in between the engraver and the die, but it's still considered engraving. And I think in Canada we're probably there as well, because we're not engraving stamps very often, but I believe we still have an engraver at the Canadian Banknote, Jorge Peral. I think he's still there as the art director. But obviously there's nowadays software involved in the engraving, but I think it depends from postal administration to postal administration. Probably in the Czech Republic, they're still doing it the old ways, but I don't have any details like that, and maybe in Sweden as well. So,
thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Wow. Well, if there's no more questions, on behalf of the Philatelic Specialist Society, merci beaucoup, Pascal. Thank you very much, Pascal, for bringing us into the archives and showing us what treasures are lurking in there for us that are interested in the design of Canadian stamps. And I'm sure you'll get quite a few emails asking you for assistance after your fine presentation. And you mentioned that Yves is still with us, so yes. Let him know that we talked about him tonight, and we're very much appreciative of his work. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. You're welcome. Merci beaucoup.
Bienvenue.
Pascal, I'd like to add my thanks to your presentation tonight as well. Just totally amazing. He's one of my heroes in Canadian stamps. I'm not as old as some of the people here, but I will be putting your certificate and your PSSC lapel pin in the mail to you tomorrow. Thanks again for a fantastic presentation.